times of conflict, there's military warfare, and then there's economic warfare.
Sanctions.
Sanctions.
Sanctions. Sanctions.
Sanctions.
Think of medieval siege tactics, only instead of cutting off a castle, you're cutting off a country. With dozens of active sanctions programs all over the world, the US often imposes economic sieges as part of its foreign policy. North Korea, Iran, Cuba, Afghanistan, and a host of other nations have all been living under strict sanctions, some of them for decades. And while people in these countries have suffered, many times the governments haven't exactly backed down. So why do sanctions often fail? Before we get into politics and policy, we need to talk about money, specifically the US dollar. Because the dollar is the main currency the world uses to trade and save, the US is kind of a middleman when international deals are made in different currencies. Being cut off from these dollar-based markets can be devastating for a country's currency and send its economy spiraling. The United States' power in this financial system also means it can bully its allies into going along with any sanctions it implements, even if they don't necessarily agree. But let's talk about why sanctions are used in the first place. The official reason is usually to pressure a government away from doing something, like developing nuclear technologies or, invading their European neighbor. But sanctions are often also aimed at something else: regime change. Think Iran, which has faced US sanctions in some form or another since the 1970s. Now, one of the stated goals of these sanctions was to make the Iranian people so miserable that they would, quote, rise up and change the behavior of the regime.
Our goal should be regime change in Iran.
US and UN sanctions limit Iran's ability to trade with other countries, shrinking their economy, raising inflation, and sending unemployment skyrocketing. Even essentials like medicines are in short supply, threatening the health of millions of Iranians. So, sanctions have succeeded in making the Iranian people miserable, but they failed at changing the Iranian regime.
از روز اول اشتباه کرده راجع به ایران و اینا خودشون هم میدونن که کاری تو ایران نمیتونن بکنن و این ملت واسطن پشت دولت و بالاخره دارن همکاری میکنن.
Similarly, in North Korea, an effort to stop the country's nuclear program has seen US and UN sanctions cutting off exports and severely limiting North Korea's ability to trade. These sanctions have had devastating effects on the civilian population, but again, they failed to halt North Korea's nuclear tests. So, if sanctions can cause so much misery, why do they often fail? There are several reasons. First, rather than cause people to rise up against their governments, sanctions usually increase hostility towards the sanctioning countries. In Afghanistan, banking restrictions imposed by the US and the World Bank led to the collapse of the Afghan economy. The country now faces a humanitarian crisis in which 98% of the population isn't getting enough food. Secondly, the longer sanctions go on, the less effective they tend to be. Countries find workarounds, new trade partners, or develop new models for working outside the international economic system. Think about Cuba, where a US trade and travel embargo has lasted for decades without achieving any of the United States' policy objectives. Thirdly, while the US does have an outsized influence on world trade, other powers exist. For example, Russia and China continue to trade with Iran and North Korea. So sanctions are much less effective at isolating a government without unanimous support from world powers. And fourthly, some countries are so integrated into the global economy that slapping sanctions on them also harms the ones doing the sanctioning. Like, there's a reason no one tries to sanction the US. Russia is another prime example of this. It's the world's second largest supplier of oil and natural gas. So any sanctions on Russia's oil and gas sector means bad news for everybody else.
Those soaring gas prices, just when they hit a record, we'd hit another one overnight.
Now, after the invasion of Ukraine, sanctions on Russia did become more severe. The likely result is that it'll be regular people feeling the most pain, but the elites, they'll probably do fine. We saw this before when sanctions on Iraq in the 90s left the people impoverished, while Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein lived in opulence. But this doesn't mean that sanctions never work. Take South Africa, for example. Sanctions are often credited with helping bring down the apartheid regime there by placing a heavy economic burden on the government in the 1980s and 90s. But a big factor in the effectiveness of those sanctions is that the apartheid regime was an ally of the US, and as a colonial minority government, relied on Western support. So when the US joined most of the rest of the world in finally sanctioning that government, the leaders of South African apartheid knew the writing was on the wall. Sanctions tend to work best when they're imposed on a country's frenemies rather than their enemies. They're also more effective when the goals are specific and the sanctioned country is given a way out. For example, some say that Iran and the US were able to negotiate and come to an agreement in 2015 because Iran was promised an end to sanctions in return for a restriction on its nuclear activities. So sanctions may not single-handedly solve conflicts, but they do create roadblocks governments must navigate, and that can sometimes be enough to force them to compromise. Oftentimes, though, sanctions only cause suffering for the average person in a targeted country. Governments and elites are insulated from their impact, and US policy goals remain unmet. But despite decades of failed examples, don't expect the US government to rethink one of its most powerful non-military tools anytime soon.